20 below, and the mountain had not been warm in 10,000 winters. The snow moved sideways across a black face of granite. No cabin up there, no chimney, no shelter a man could name. And yet, somewhere in the middle of all that dead and frozen stone, a thin thread of smoke was rising, pale, steady, patient. It should not have been there. Down in the valley, a man stood frozen in his tracks, staring up at it, the breath stopping in his chest. He had walked that mountain more winters than he could count. He knew every trail, every hollow, every cold and empty seam of rock, and he knew, with a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, that no one alive should be up there. But the smoke kept climbing, as if the mountain itself had drawn a slow, deep breath, and decided at last to keep someone alive. Who was keeping a fire inside the mountain? To understand that thread of smoke, the story has to turn back, not far, just a few short months, to the end of an autumn that had already begun to smell like winter, to a woman who had decided, alone, that she would not let the cold have her. Her name was Elara Vance. She was 34 years old, though the mountain had already tried more than once to make her older. She had come from flat country far to the east, the daughter of a man who built barrels for a living, a quiet man with sawdust in the creases of his hands. He had taught her the things a barrel knows, how wood holds, how it fails, how a thing built right will keep what's inside it long after the world outside has changed its mind. She had loved a man once, a miner named Elias. He had a low, sure voice, and he used it only when he meant a thing. One evening, standing on a ridge above their claim, he had told her, "This is where we grow old." He believed it. And then one winter the earth took him, deep in a shaft that folded without warning. Quiet and final, the way bad news always seems to come. She did not scream when they told her. She did not fall. She put on her coat and she walked out into the wind, and she turned her face away so that no one would see her shoulders move. That was the only kind of grieving she knew how to do. The private kind. The kind that keeps its hands busy and its eyes dry. 2 years passed, and what she had left of him fit into almost nothing. A long-eared mule the color of wood smoke. A patient, careful animal named Amos, who tilted his head when she spoke to him as though he were weighing every word. A crate of tools, a worn coat, a little tin of coffee she rationed like medicine, and a piece of paper. A claim to a stretch of steep, timbered ground high on the shoulder of the range, where a creek came tumbling down out of the basin in a chain of small falls. It was the ground Elias had chosen, the ground where they were supposed to grow old together. Now she was the only one growing anything on it, and what she was growing, she quietly suspected, was a grave. She did not let herself think that way often, but the mountain reminded her, morning after morning. She had built a cabin through the summer, cut the logs herself, dragged them, notched them, raised the walls with her own 2 hands until they cracked open at the base of every finger. By the time the aspens turned to hammered gold, the walls were up, and by the time the first hard frost came, she understood something with the same cold clarity she'd learned at the mouth of that shaft. The cabin was going to kill her. The logs had cured wrong in the thin, dry air. They twisted in their notches. They pulled apart. Every gap she packed with moss and clay in the morning had opened again by dusk. She would climb up and look down the length of the wall and see daylight where there should have been none. And the hearth she'd built, the crooked stone chimney climbing the north wall. It only drew when the wind agreed to let it. The wind almost never agreed. One evening she lit a small fire and allowed herself a cup of coffee at the table. Then the wind came around the shoulder of the peak, reached down the flue, and pushed the smoke back into the room in a single soft cough that stung her eyes and made the mule bray outside. She sat there in the haze, hands around the tin cup, and understood that she had built a house the mountain did not respect. She had heard the miners talk about the cold up here. They spoke of it the way sailors speak of the sea, not as weather, as something with a temper, something with a grudge. She had once watched a family carried out of a failing cabin, the father alive when they broke the door, gone 3 hours after. He had said only one thing worth remembering. I fed it everything I had. It ate everything I had. Then it ate me. The it was the cold, and she promised herself, sitting in that smoke-filled room, she would not build a house that made her its fuel. She just didn't yet know what she would build instead. She was still turning it over the morning she rode down into the settlement for nails. It was a small, hard place, a single street, a church that seated a handful of souls on a good Sunday, a store that sold everything at prices set by the man who owned nearly all of it. His name was Cyrus Thorne. He owned the biggest mine above the gulch. He owned the freight line, the assay office, the store, and by way of unpaid notes, a good many of the cabins the miners slept in. He was 52. He wore a black coat cut in the Eastern fashion, and a beard trimmed square as a carpenter's level. He had the pale, patient eyes of a man who had never lost a negotiation, because he never entered one he did not already own. He came out of the back of the store as she counted her coins. He did not raise his voice. Men like that never have to. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "a word, if you can spare one." She could not spare one. She spared it anyway. He rested a gloved hand on the warm stovepipe, as though testing the temperature of a horse. "You're ground on the high creek," he said. "I've been thinking about it. It's hard country for a woman alone. Your cabin isn't closed in. You haven't laid up your winter's wood." His mouth moved into something he must have believed was kindness. "I'm prepared to be generous. Cash this afternoon. A warm room through the spring. And come the thaw, we talk again." The store went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone is pretending not to listen. She heard, somewhere in the back of her mind, her father's knuckles tapping the head of a barrel. Sound wood does not argue. It waits. So she let the silence sit. She let him feel the size of it. Then she spoke, low and even. "Mr. Thorne, I thank you for your interest, but my ground is not for sale, not this afternoon, not in the spring." Something moved behind the pale eyes, not anger. He didn't do anger in public. Something older than anger, something already doing arithmetic. "You misunderstand me," he said softly. He began drawing on his glove, one finger at a time, as though the matter were already filed away. "I'm not making an offer against your comfort. I'm making an offer against your winter." He touched the brim of his hat. "In the spring, I'll still want that ground. I'll buy it then. From your estate, if it comes to that. My hope is that it doesn't." And then he walked out into the pale light, and the door swung shut behind him. She tied her small paper of nails into her coat with hands that did not shake, because she had promised herself long ago that they would not. She rode the switchbacks home in a silence so complete she could hear the mule's shoes strike the frozen shale. 1, 2, 1, 2, all the way up to the ruined little cabin waiting on the flat. And she understood, past any hope of forgetting, what he had really offered her. He had not tried to buy her land. He had offered to buy the ending of her story and to pay for it in advance. He had, in his cold and careful way, given her 3 months. That night, she did not weep. She sharpened her tools instead. She oiled them. She sat by the dead hearth with the lantern turned low, and she did his arithmetic from the other side. Then she spoke, out loud, to the mule through the wall, to the dark timber below, to the mountain that had not once, in all this time, agreed with her about anything. I am not the story he thinks he's buying. The mountain did not answer. It never did. But 2 mornings later, the mule would break his tether and go looking for something the mountain was finally willing to give. The mule was gone at first light. She found the broken tether swinging in the wind and his tracks pressed deep into the frost, leading away from the ruined cabin, up, into the black timber above the flat, not down toward the creek, where the good grazing was, up toward the broken shoulder of rock that rose behind the claim like an old tooth pushed through the gum of the ridge. She had walked the base of that outcrop twice all summer, once thinking of Elias, once with a rifle in her hand, after something large had left its sign near the tent. She had never once climbed to the top. Now she followed the mule's tracks with a lead rope coiled over her shoulder and an unlit lantern swinging in her fist, her breath white in front of her mouth. And she found him standing in a shadow that was not a shadow. It was a mouth, a low opening in the granite face, no wider than a mule's shoulders, set back beneath an overhanging brow of stone. From the trail below, it read as nothing, a darker patch on a dark cliff, something the eye would slide right past. Amos had walked into it as calm as a cat walking into a barn, and when she came up beside him, the air that touched her face out of that opening was still. That was the first thing she noticed. Not cold, not warm, still, as though the wind that had cut across this ridge all summer had simply never learned the place existed. She lit the lantern. She stepped past the mule, one hand on his neck for both their sakes, and she went in. The floor was dry gravel and flat plates of rock, sloping up for a dozen paces before it leveled. The ceiling rose away from her lantern into a smooth vault of granite, higher than she could reach. The chamber ran back into the dark, 30 feet, maybe more, before the walls closed toward each other into a crack too narrow for a child. There was no drip of water, no wet streaks down the stone, no smell of rot or animal, only old rock and older air. And high above her head, near the back, the lantern light caught something. A hairline crack in the vault. A fissure that ran up into the black and did not close. A flue. She stood there a long while. Amos came in behind her and settled, because he was a mule of firm opinions, and his opinion of this place was that it was good. She reached out and laid her bare palm flat against the granite wall. It was cold, but not the cold she knew. Not the greedy cold of iron in winter, the kind that pulls the heat out of your hand as fast as you can give it. This was a patient cold, a cold that had decided long ago what it wished to be and did not intend to be argued out of it. And something in her went very still, because she had felt this before. Her father's shop, high summer, her small hand pressed against the side of a full barrel, and the wood cool beneath her palm even in the heat, because whatever was inside had not yet agreed to be warm. She could almost hear him. "Mass," he used to say, tapping the stave with 2 knuckles. "Sound wood. What's inside stays what's inside." She stood in the dark of the mountain and understood. The men in the valley would have called this a hole in a cliff. She was beginning to see something else. She saw a wall that would not argue. She saw a room a person could build inside the bone of the country itself. Not a dugout. She had seen dugouts. They rotted. They wept. They filled with mold and the small brown mice that carried fever. A dugout was a hole in dirt. This was not dirt. This was stone that had held its own counsel for 10,000 winters. And a plan began to take shape in her mind, whole and clear, the way a barrel takes shape in a cooper's hands before he ever picks up a single hoop. A frame set inside the chamber. A wall of stacked stone across the mouth to break the wind without smothering the fire. A small iron stove, vented up through that natural crack in the ceiling with a length of tin. A curtain of blanket and sand at the inner door, and behind it all, the deep wall of the mountain, giving back through the long cold nights whatever small heat she had fed it during the day. It was not madness. Madness was what she had built down on the flat. A chimney that only drew when the wind was kind. This was something older and simpler. This was mass, and she was going to teach it to herself. She told no one. Walking the mule back down through the frost, she did not even let herself smile. She had learned long ago that a plan spoken too early is a plan given away. If the town heard of a widow moving into a cave, they would find it comical, and Thorn would find it useful. So she said nothing at all. She started small. Over 2 days, she carried up loads of flat plate stone from the bank of the creek, one at a time in the mule's panniers, so that no one passing below would see her hauling enough of anything to make them wonder. She cut standing dead pine, straight as gun barrels, and dragged the poles up to the mouth of the chamber. She did not raise the frame yet. She only laid the pieces out inside, in the order she meant to use them, the way her father had laid staves across the shop floor before he ever touched a hoop. "Order first," he used to say. "Order is 3/4 of the work." She had given herself 10 days for the wall. The mountain gave her 4. The wind changed on an afternoon that had started clear. It came around from the northwest and did not stop. By dusk, it was bending the tops of the pines into long, slow boughs that groaned in the wood. By full dark, the first snow was driving sideways across the flat, dry and mean, the kind that arrives at that height without asking anyone's leave. She was inside the cabin when it hit, and she heard the ridgepole speak, a low, tearing groan, deep in the timber above her head. She had 2 hours warning, and she used every minute of it. She did not panic. She moved the coffee tin, with the last of what Elias had left her, into a canvas sack. Her father's tools, the maul, the wool blankets, the sheepskin, the matches, the little store of meal and dried apple. She tied it all to the mule's back with the lead rope and a strap of harness leather. And then the roof went. Not all at once. It went in one long tearing sound that started at the ridge and traveled the length of the wall like a shot going down a barrel. The shakes lifted, hung an instant in the wind as if considering, and were gone. And behind them, a third of the ridgepole came down into the room in a shower of clay and moss and the ruin of a hearth that had never once drawn clean. She was already outside. At the mule's head, her hand on his cheek strap, the lantern dead in the wind. She did not look back at the cabin. She looked up the slope to where the black shoulder of the outcrop stood against a sky the color of bruised iron, and she started walking. Amos came with her because it was his firm opinion that she had, at last, chosen the right direction. They climbed through the timber in the dark, in the wind, in a cold that had no business being so deep so early. She fell twice. Twice the mule braced and let her haul herself up by his harness, patient as stone. And when she reached the mouth of the cave, she had no breath left for gratitude. She led him in past the loose, stacked plates, into the still air of the chamber, and she sat down with her back against the granite wall. She had not laid a fire. She hadn't the strength. She sat in the dark in her wet coat, her hand flat against the stone behind her. And slowly, over the first hour, then the second, she noticed a thing that woke her more thoroughly than any fire could have. The stone at her back was not cold, not truly, not the way the wind was cold, screaming 20 feet away at the mouth of the cave. It was cool, the way a cellar is cool in the heat of summer, the way the deep side of a full barrel is cool in July. Whatever the mountain had decided its temperature would be, the storm was not being allowed past the throat of the chamber to change its mind. She reached to the opposite wall. Same. She touched the plate stone she had carried up 2 days before. Same. She had no thermometer. She did not need one. What her own body was telling her, in the long, slow hour it took her heart to stop pounding, was that the mountain had finally, in its own ancient, wordless way, agreed with her. Not with kindness, with mass. With the stubborn refusal of Granite to be talked into anything by weather. She slept that night with her head against the mule's warm flank and her back to the stone, and she did not dream. When she woke, the light at the mouth was the gray of a storm passing, not the gold of a sunrise. She went and looked out, and the cabin below was a shape she did not, at first, recognize. The far wall was down, the roof line broken. All the chinking she had packed and repacked through the autumn lay scattered in the snow like the pale insides of a thing that had been opened up. She stood a long time. She did not weep. She had already spent, at the mouth of that shaft 2 winters gone, whatever tears she had in her for houses. What she felt instead was a cold, clean clarity, the kind her father used to get when a bad barrel finally split, so he could stop pretending he might save it. The cabin was over. The old plan was over. And the cave, in a single night, had become the only argument left standing. She began that morning to take the ruined cabin apart for its bones. Good boards came up the slope on the mule's back in bundles. The stove grate, the length of tin she'd bought for a chimney that was never raised, that she carried herself over her own shoulder because the mule sensibly refused to be trusted with sheet metal in a wind. She worked 3 days in a cold that never quite climbed back to where it should have been. And by the end of it, the frame stood inside the chamber. 4 posts, cross members overhead, plank walls spaced for air and packed with pine bough and moss and strips of old canvas. She had done in 6 days what she'd thought would take her 3 weeks, because the storm had shown her, without mercy, exactly how little time she had left. And it was on the way down for that last load of tin that she crossed the tracks in the snow. Fresh. A man's boots. A trapper's line along the frozen creek. She did not see him. He saw her. She caught only a movement at the edge of her eye, back in the willows. Something that might have been a man setting a beaver line, and might have been a man watching a widow drag a sheet of metal up a mountain. She did not turn her head. She kept walking, but if she had turned, she would have seen a lean, weathered man named Gideon Marsh crouched low behind the biggest willow, his rifle across his knees, and on his face an expression it rarely wore. The look of a man who has just realized that a story he thought he understood has more chapters in it than he'd counted on. He watched her out of sight around the bend. He watched the mule's tracks after her. And he watched, above the trees, the black shoulder of that outcrop where he had never once in all his seasons seen a living soul go. That night, in his own small cabin down the drainage, he said nothing to anyone, because he did not yet know what he had seen. But he knew this. Down in the settlement, a certain mine owner had let it be known, in the quiet way such things are let known, that the widow Vance was not likely to see the spring, and that a man who wished to be useful might keep an eye on her progress, or her lack of it. Gideon Marsh owed Cyrus Thorne nothing, but he was a man who took an interest in unusual things, and a widow carrying tin up a granite cliff in the teeth of the first real storm. That was an unusual thing. He resolved, over his supper, to run that stretch of creek again in a few days, just to see what she carried next, just to see whether the smoke, when it finally came out of a cabin or out of a hole in the mountain. The days that followed were a race against a calendar no one had written down. The stove had to be seated. The flue threaded through the fissure. The mouth of the cave narrowed against the wind. The bed platform built against the deep wall. Wood split and stacked and hidden where the drifts could not bury it. She began with the stone wall across the mouth. Not mortar. Mortar at that height, in that cold, was a promise that would not keep. She stacked it dry. The way her father had once shown her a spring house was built. One heavy stone at the base, a lighter one atop it. Cross-locked at every third course, long stones laid through the wall to bind the two faces. She worked in wool mittens with the fingertips cut away, blowing on her hands between courses, choosing each stone by the shape it made against the last, the way she had once chosen staves for a barrel head. She wanted 2 things from that wall: to stop the wind, and to keep the throat of the entry narrow so that whatever air did come through came slow, in a stream she could feel and manage, not in the sideways rush that had torn her roof away. By the end of the 2nd day, the wall stood at her chest. By the 4th, it rose past her shoulders and fell back in the center to leave a gap she could pass through sideways with a pack. In 4 days, she had not spoken a single word aloud, and when she stepped back and looked at what she had made, She felt something she had not felt since they lowered Elias into the ground. She felt calm. Her father had a saying for it. Grief, he told her once, is mostly a problem of the hands. A set of hands with good work in them is a set of hands the grief has a harder time catching. Then came the stove. A little iron firebox, hardly bigger than a bread box, cracked at one hinge, the door held shut with a twist of wire. She'd bought it 2 summers gone from a man closing up a mining kitchen, and for her purposes, it was exactly enough. She set it on a platform of flat stone in the corner where the ceiling rose highest, so that any smoke that leaked would rise clean and not sting the eyes of a person lying on the bed. And then came the part that had frightened her from the very beginning. The flue. The crack in the vault was there, but it was a hairline. A slot she could pass a knife blade into, no more. And any pipe she meant to run through it needed a hole to run through. And a hole through granite of that thickness was ordinarily the work of a drill and 2 strong men. She had neither. She had a hand chisel, a small hammer, and one honest fact. The mountain had already begun the work for her. She didn't need to cut a hole. She needed to widen a crack the stone had spent 10,000 years opening. She climbed onto a keg. She set 2 candles on tin plates to steady the reach of her lantern, and she worked the chisel into the fissure, tapping in the short, measured strokes her father had used to seat a bung. She did not chase the crack. She followed it. Granite is not an obliging stone, but it has a grain if you know how to read it. And the grain of that fissure ran up and out toward the sunny face of the cliff. She followed the grain. 3 days. 6 hours a day, no more. Because past 6, her shoulder went, and the chisel began to skate. And by the end of the 3rd day, she had a slot she could pass her forearm through, angled up and out, emerging on the outer face of the rock as nothing more than a slightly wider crack among 100 natural ones. From the trail below, it read as weather. She threaded the tin. She packed the gaps with wet clay and dry grass. And that evening, she lit her first fire. Half an armload of split pine, no thicker than her wrist. She stood back and raised her hand toward the pipe at the ceiling, and felt the thing she had been most afraid she would not feel. Draft. A steady, quiet pull. From the mouth of the cave, into the room, up the tin, out the slot, into the sky. Not a roar. Not the greedy suck of a bad flue burning through a cord in a night. A patient pull. The mountain, breathing through the vent she had cut. Slow and even, like a sleeper. She sat on the edge of the unfinished platform and let the little fire warm the corner. The deep wall behind her was not warm yet. It would not be warm for hours. That, she was beginning to understand, was exactly the point. Down in the valley that same evening, in a low room with a plank bar and a stove that drew better than any hearth for miles, Gideon Marsh finally told what he had seen. "There's smoke coming out of the mountain," he said, looking into his cup rather than at any of the faces around him. "Not from a chimney, from the rock. The widow's cabin is down, and she's living up there, in a hole in the cliff." The laughter came before he finished. It was not cruel laughter. It was the reflexive laugh of men who had been cold in badly built rooms all their working lives, and knew past any argument that a cave was not a room, and never would be. Someone said she'd taken to living like a bear now. Someone else said if she wanted a cave, she should have married a bat. But one man at the stove did not laugh. Nathaniel Crane was 58 years old, a carpenter by trade, gray in the beard, a man whose silence in a laughing room was itself a kind of speech. He waited until the laughter had run its length. He set his cup down flat. "Stone doesn't hold heat," he said. And his voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man passing along a truth he'd been taught by 3 generations before him. Stone pulls it out of you. You've all sat on a cold rock in the fall and felt it come right through your trousers. That woman is sleeping against a block of ice. She'll burn twice the wood any of you burn, and be twice as cold doing it. He picked his cup back up. Somebody should have told her before she pulled the roof off her own house. And a woman standing near the door said nothing at all. Her name was Merritt Wick. Her husband worked a shift at the big mine, and she had come in to collect his week's pay before it found its way across a bar. She was looking past all of them, out the dark window, up toward the high country where the storms were born. Her mouth moved without quite opening, the way a woman's mouth moves when she is deciding whether a thing is her business. Then she stepped forward and touched the trapper's sleeve. "Where is she getting her water?" she asked, low, meant for him alone. "In a month, there'll be 4 feet on that flat. She can't be walking down to the creek every morning." He hadn't thought of the water. He nodded because he had no answer, but the words did not stay in that room. Words never stayed in that room. By the next afternoon, the story had traveled to the store, to the church, and inevitably to a certain back office, where a certain man made it his business to hear everything the town heard within a day of its hearing it. Cyrus Thorne listened to the whole of it without a change in his face, and at the end he said one sentence, which was repeated to 2 other people before nightfall. "Well," he said, "that's convenient." He closed his ledger. "When the spring comes, I won't have to argue with a widow. I'll only have to argue with an estate." The man who told him did not laugh. He set the ledger back on its shelf and thought a thought he did not permit himself to say aloud: that there is a difference between wishing a person ill and pricing that ill into next year's books, and that the second was the harder of the 2 to forgive. She came down into the settlement herself a few days on, not because she wanted to, because she was low on lamp oil and needed salt for the pork, and because she understood something a solitary woman must never forget: that a town which forgets your face is a town that will bury you without noticing. So she rode in with her back straight and her collar up, and she stepped into the store as though it were any ordinary day. It was not an ordinary day. She felt it before her eyes adjusted to the dim, a small silence where the ordinary murmur of the place should have been, the particular hush of a room full of people who have just been talking about you. Then the storekeeper called out, "Good morning," a little too kindly. And the silence closed back over. She read out her small list. She stood by the stove and let the warmth come back into her fingers. And she did not, at first, see Thorne. But she heard him, the scrape of a chair in the back, the low murmur of his voice. She had time to arrange her face. She did not arrange it into anything at all. She simply let it be what it was: the face of a woman who had built a wall of granite in 4 days, and was not, on this particular morning, going to be made small by anyone. He came out with his coat open at the throat, and something a stranger might have mistaken for warmth. Mrs. Vance? His eyes moved over her coat, her boots, the mud on her hem, and returned to her face. I'd understood you were living rough. I trust I was misinformed. She let the silence sit. She had learned the last time that silence was a coin this man did not know how to spend. Then she answered him, in a voice pitched to carry to every listening ear in the room. Because a thing said in public holds a man like Thorn more surely than a thing said in private. Mr. Thorn, I am living exactly as roughly as I need to, and no rougher. I eat twice a day. I sleep warm. My mule is fat. I did not come to town to reconsider your offer. A pause. I came for salt. The loafers by the door went very still. The storekeeper's hand stopped on the scoop, and Thorn did not lose his composure. He never did, not in public. But something in the quality of his stillness changed. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of ground he thought he understood, and has just discovered runs with an ore he never tested for. You're living, he said slowly, in a cave. I'm living, she answered, in a room. There's a difference. My room happens to have granite for 3 of its walls. She held his eyes. Your bank happens to have granite for its vault. I don't hear anyone calling your money cave money. Somewhere near the door, a sound that might have been a cough, or the beginning of a laugh thought better of. Thorn inclined his head. 1 degree, no more. And he walked out into the pale noon light, without another word. She paid for her salt. She tied her parcels into her coat. She untied the mule and mounted. And she was halfway across the little bridge at the north end of the street when a woman came hurrying out into the road behind her. No shawl, no coat, skirts held up out of the mud. Mrs. Vance. Merritt Wick's face was flushed with more than the cold. Please, a word. Elara reined in. She did not dismount. The woman came up close alongside the mule, so her voice would not carry. My husband works the day shift. He doesn't talk much. But last spring, the survey crew ran a line up the west bank of your creek. He was on it. They took samples out of the ground below your falls. She glanced back once toward the store. Those samples never went into the company books. They went into Mr. Thorne's private safe. My husband is the one who set them there. Elara sat very still on the mule's back. There's a vein under your ground, Merritt said. My husband won't say how rich. He'll only say that Mr. Thorne has been very patient, for a man who is not, by nature, a patient man. A breath. That's why he's patient. Do you understand? She understood. She had understood since that first offer that Thorne had never wanted a widow's parcel out of neighborliness. What she had not understood, until this moment, was the shape of the thing he was really trying to buy. He had not been threatening to buy her land. He had been waiting to buy her death. Because a dead woman with no kin does not sign a deed. Her ground simply comes loose and falls in the spring thaw to whatever careful hand is waiting beneath it. Thank you, Elara said, and she reached down and laid her gloved hand, just for a moment, over the woman's bare one where it rested on the mule's shoulder. Thank you for telling me. Does anyone else know? Not that I can tell. Then let it stay that way. For your husband's sake. A pause. For yours. Merritt nodded. She stepped back, and she recovered her skirts and hurried away across the street with the brisk, pretending walk of a woman who has just remembered a kettle left on the fire. Ilara touched her heel to the mule's side and started up the switchbacks, and she carried a new arithmetic in her chest the whole way home. It was not a warmer arithmetic. It was a colder and a clearer one. Cyrus Thorne was not, in his own mind, a cruel man. He was a sum. He was patience with a price on it. He was granite in his own cold way. She would simply have to be more granite than he was. She reached the cave in the last blue hour of the afternoon, and she did not light the stove. She sat in the dark of the framed room with her hand flat on the deep wall, and she counted, wood on hand, wood standing dead within a half-day's drag, salt, meal, dried apple, the tallow for the lantern, the candles for the long nights. She counted it out on her fingers, the way her father had counted staves. If the winter came in ordinary, she had enough to the edge of spring. If it came in hard, if it came in the way that first storm had come, she had until the deep of it, no further. Either way, she would need a thing she did not yet have, a way to make the wood work twice, once as flame in the little stove, and once as heat banked deep in the wall of the mountain, given back slow and free through the long dark hours when no fire burned at all. She sat with that a long time. Then she rose and felt her way to the mouth and stood in the throat of the stone wall with her face turned into the cold, so that she could feel exactly the size of the thing she would have to defeat. Above her, unseen in the dark, the smoke rose thin and straight and patient into the sky, and somewhere far below, in a warm and quiet office, a patient man was already doing his own arithmetic, and beginning, very slowly, to wonder why the widow in the mountain had not yet started to die. The second layer went up in the days after the first snow melted back, though she knew in her bones the melting was only the mountain drawing breath before the next blow. It was not a wall she built now. It was a curtain, a frame of green pine set into the inner doorway of the framed room, and across it a loose woven wool blanket she had traded a strip of good harness leather for. Down at the Wick cabin, one gray afternoon, when Merritt had, without a single word about any of it, quietly set a second cup on the table and filled it. The blanket hung all the way to the floor, and along its bottom edge, Ilara had sewn a long pocket and filled that pocket with clean, dry creek sand, so that it lay heavy and flat against the stone and let no draft slip beneath it. When she needed air, she rolled it up. When she needed to hold the warmth in, she let it fall. Between the stacked stone at the mouth of the cave and the sanded blanket at the inner door, she had made herself a kind of lock. A pocket of still, held air that the wind could not reach, no matter how it clawed at the outer wall. She tested it on a night that turned bitter past all reason. She lit no fire at all. She let the room give up, hour by hour, whatever heat the deep wall had stored during the day. And she woke a few hours before dawn, cold but alive. And she reached out from beneath her blankets and laid her bare hand flat against the granite behind the platform, and the stone gave back a soft, patient warmth into her palm. A warmth that had no earthly business being there. Not in that cold. Not at that hour. "Mass," she said aloud, into the dark, to the mule standing in his corner. He blew air through his nose in the black, and she chose, as she always chose, to hear it as agreement. She lay back, and she did not sleep. She thought a long while about her father's rough hand on the head of a barrel, and the 2 knuckles he used to tap it with. Sound wood, sound stave. What is inside stays what is inside. She might have lain there thinking of him until morning, but she did not get the chance. Because when the gray light finally came, and she went out to break the skin of ice on the mule's water bucket, she found Amos standing on 3 legs, the right forefoot cocked up off the ground, his great head hanging lower than it ever hung. She went to him. She ran her hand slowly down the length of that leg, and the joint was hot beneath her fingers, swollen, and he flinched, hard when she touched it. And something inside her chest went cold, and went still, all at once. She was no stockwoman. She was no doctor of animals. She knew barrels, and she knew grief, and she knew the particular arithmetic of surviving a winter alone. She did not know this. She got the foot up and cradled it, and looked for the cause. A stone bruise, a thorn, a cut, a puncture gone bad. There was nothing to see, only the heat and the swelling, and the way he leaned away from his own weight. She thought, first, of a strain. 2 long months he had hauled stone and tin and timber up that cruel mountain for her, load after load, without complaint. And then she thought of a thing she did not want to think of at all, a thing that lived in a place beneath her ribs where she did not like to look. She thought of what this winter would be, without him, not the loss of a work animal. She had lost things before, and gone on. She thought of the nights, of the long, black, howling night still ahead of her, and of a cave with no warm flank to sleep against. No slow, honest breathing in the dark. No pair of steady ears turning toward her voice when she was fool enough, or lonely enough, to speak aloud. He was the last living thing that had known Elias. He had been Elias's mule before he was ever hers. Chosen, her husband had once told her with a straight face, for the honest shape of his ears. And she would be damned before she let this mountain take him too. She made a poultice from the last of the linseed oil she'd carried up for treating wood, and a handful of dark tea leaves scraped from the very bottom of her tin. She wrapped the swollen joint in flannel, torn from an old shift she would not miss. She built him a proper stall there in the outer chamber, close in against the deep wall, so that what small warmth the stone gave off in that outer space would still reach him through the worst of the night. She carried his water bucket inside so it would not skin over with ice within the hour. And then she sat down beside him on the cold gravel floor, her back against the rough panel of the stall, her coffee going lukewarm and forgotten in her 2 hands. And she talked to him, in a low, steady voice she had not used since a warm kitchen in a flat, green country, a lifetime and a world ago. "You're going to walk out of this," she told him quietly. "Do you hear me? You're going to walk down that trail in the spring, at my shoulder, not carrying a thing, just walking. And you're going to put your feet down in the mud, and you're going to eat the first green grass of the whole year." His near ear turned back toward the sound of her. "You don't get to be the price of this winter," she said, and her voice, so steady until now, caught on the words. "You hear me? You don't get to be that." His warm breath moved across the back of her hand. "I have already paid too much of that price," she whispered. "I paid it in a shaft, 2 winters gone. I will not pay it again, not with you." And there, in the dark of the mountain, with her forehead pressed against the warm neck of a lame old mule, The woman who had not wept at the mouth of the shaft where they drew her husband up out of the earth, who had not wept at the ruin of the cabin she'd broken her hands to build, who had not so much as blinked under the pale, patient, waiting eyes of Cyrus Thorne, wept. Not the loud way, the other way. The small, silent, shaking way of a person who has carried a great weight alone for a very long time, and has finally found a place private enough and safe enough to set it down, just for a quarter of an hour, just long enough to be a person again, and not only a will to survive. And when the quarter hour was spent, she wiped her face on her sleeve. She put her hat back on her head, and she stood up and went out into the cold and split the day's wood. She left the poultice where it was. She would change it, she told herself, at noon. And she did. By the third day, the heat had gone out of the joint. By the fifth, he was walking sound. She kept him inside 3 days more, out of nothing but pure, stubborn caution. And then one clear, brittle morning she let him out onto the trampled snow before the mouth of the cave. And he shook himself all over, head to tail, the way a mule shakes when he is remembering the good, whole shape of his own body. He dropped his nose into a clean drift and blew it back out in a bright spray of white. And she stood in the mouth of the stone wall and watched him do it, with an ache behind her breastbone she did not try, this time, to name. She was still standing there when the mountain changed its mind about the weather. The wind came around the shoulder of the peak, much the way it had come that first ruinous night, but slower now, older, heavier, more deliberate in the coming, as though it had learned patience over the years, and had all the time in the world to do what it meant to do. There was no snow in it yet. There was only the smell of it, for she had learned, over her seasons in that high country, that the deepest colds gave a warning. A sharp, thin, iron edge on the air that arrived a day or two ahead of the weather that carried it. A thing you could not see and could not measure, but could read, if you had learned how. This cold carried that edge. She lifted her face into it and stood a long minute in the throat of her stone wall, reading it the way her father had read a plank of oak before he ever set his saw to it, and what she read there frightened her. So she turned and went back inside and began to do all the quiet things she had been preparing to do since the night the first storm tore the roof from her house. She carried every stick of the split wood into the outer chamber, where no drift, however deep, could ever bury it beyond her reach. She filled every bucket she owned from the slow seep near the mouth. She checked the sand in the hem of the blanket and pressed it flat against the stone. She laid a careful bed of fine tinder in the belly of the little stove and set a single match down beside it, so that when the time came, if her hands were too stiff and cold to strike 3 matches, she would still be able to make fire with 1. Then she lay down on the platform bed, fully dressed, beneath every blanket she owned, and she listened. And down in the valley, the whole town was listening too, though most of them did not yet know what they were listening for. For a few days before this, in the low-ceilinged company store, a small and quiet thing had happened. A thing that would come down out of the pass behind the cold, like a shadow riding behind a horseman. Cyrus Thorne had walked to the counter and told the clerk to change a price. Company cordwood, he said, in that even and unhurried voice of his, would be sold from that morning forward at twice its former price, to any account not carried on the company payroll. The clerk wrote the new figure into the ledger without lifting his eyes from the page. He had a small daughter at home with a rattling cough, and he had learned, working for a certain kind of man, that not looking up was its own small form of survival. The change went into the book, and it did not need announcing. By the following afternoon, every man in that valley who did not draw a company wage understood one plain and simple thing. The price of his winter had just doubled. There was an old man who understood it slower than most. His name was Tobias Finch. He was 71 years old and half deaf in one ear, and he had lived alone in a low cabin at the south edge of the settlement since his wife had passed the summer before. He had wintered on his own cut wood more years than most of the men laughing in the saloons had been alive. Every autumn he counted his cordwood the same way, walking the length of the pile with a stick, touching each stick with it, one for one, so that he would know without any argument left in it whether he had enough to see him through. That autumn he had told his neighbors he had enough. A cord and a half. And a cord and a half would do, he had said, if a man burned it low and slept in close beside the stove. But a cord and a half would not do. Not at the doubled price. Not with the cold that was even now leaning down out of the high pass. If the whole truth were told, it would not have done at the old price either. Not in any of the last 5 hard years. The old man had been living, all that time, on a sum that only came out even in a gentle winter. And this was not going to be a gentle winter. There was a younger man who saw the danger before Tobias ever did. A quiet man, a shift boss at the big mine, unmarried, who years before had come up into that country green and coatless off a wagon from the flatlands, and to whom this same old man had once given the loan of a good wool coat. Given it without being asked, and then never once let him find a way to pay it back. That younger man walked past the Finch cabin one morning, on his way home from a long shift, and he saw the size of the pile in the lean-to, and he did, in his head, the arithmetic the proud old man would not do for himself. So he went home, and he took a full quarter of his own cord from behind the boarding house, and he loaded it onto a sledge, and he dragged it through the snow to the old man's door. And he left it there, without knocking, without a word, because he knew the exact shape of Tobias Finch's pride. He wanted the old man to come out at first light and simply believe he had miscounted in the fall, that the pile had been bigger all along than his fear had let him see. But the old man did not believe that. Tobias came out at dawn, and he saw the fresh tracks in the new snow, and he followed them with his eye, all the way back down the street, to the boarding house, and he understood. He sat a long while on his own step, in his shirt sleeves, in the cold, with the truth of it settling over him, and then he rose and went back inside, and left the wood exactly where it lay, because he would not insult the boy by refusing it. He would burn it, and come the spring, he would find some way to repay it that the young man would be willing to accept. That was as far into the future as he let himself plan. He was old enough and wise enough to know that plans reaching past the spring, for a man of his years, were a kind of vanity. And then the cold that Alara had smelled upon the wind came down in earnest. It came without snow at first. a long, steady, leaning press out of the northwest that bent the tops of the pines into shapes they held for hours, and found the seam of every ill-fitted door in the valley, and reached its cold fingers inside. By the fall of night, the warmth was going out of every cabin in that settlement faster than any fire alive could put it back. By the deep middle of the night, men were feeding their stoves twice as fast as ever before, simply to hold the little warmth they had left. And then the snow began. It came sideways from the very first flake, not the dry, forgiving powder Alara had learned to read as a mild and passing thing. This was the heavy, wet, driving kind. The kind that swallowed the far side of a street inside a single hour and turned the whole of the world into a howling white blindness, in which the only fixed and certain points left in all creation were the fires men kept. And in every cabin along that street, the same cruel arithmetic was being worked over and over through the long hours. Open the door for a breath of air and lose the heat. Keep it sealed for the heat and lose the air. And Tobias Finch, in his low cabin at the south edge of it all, made his own quiet choice. He fed his stove hard in the early evening. He fed it once again later, when the wind first began to truly scream. And then he lay himself down on the cot beside it, in his boots, with his old coat pulled up over him, because he was tired in a way he did not much care to put a name to. And he told himself he would rise again in an hour or two and feed the fire once more before the worst of the night. He did not rise in an hour or two. The stove burned down slowly to a bed of red coals, and the coals held their small and stubborn heat a while after that. And then, at last, they did not. And the cold came into that small room the way water comes into a boat that a tired man has stopped bailing, slowly at first, and then all at once. And the old man on the cot grew as still and as quiet as the cold iron stove beside him. And there, a kinder story would turn its eyes gently away. But this story cannot, because the whole hard meaning of it turns upon a single, terrible difference. A difference of a few short miles and one wall of stone. For at that very same hour, up on the high flat above the frozen falls, deep inside the body of the mountain, a woman sat on the edge of a platform bed, with her hand resting on the warm neck of a mule, and listened to that very same wind. The blanket door was down. The sand lay flat and dark against the stone. The little stove had held its small fire since noon, and she had let it die hours ago, on purpose, and had not lit it again. And what she felt now, in the very worst weather she had ever in her life stood inside of, was a room that was cool at the shoulders and warm at the small of her back. A room whose warmth had not fallen in 7 long and howling hours by more than the space of 3 or 4 degrees. Beside her in the dark, the old mule breathed the slow, deep, even breath of a creature entirely and perfectly at peace. The storm was screaming its full fury at the mouth of the cave, not 20 feet away, but it was not being let in. Past the dry stacked stone, past the sanded blanket, against the deep wall of the mountain where the granite had spent 2 patient months, quietly banking away the small warmths of 100 little fires. The storm was simply not permitted to arrive. She rested her forehead, just for a moment, against the mule's warm neck, and she spoke to him, softly, not because he could understand her, but because she had learned that a thing spoken aloud, in the dark, is somehow more certain and more true than a thing only thought. "Let it come," she whispered to him. "Whatever it's bringing down out of that past tonight, let it come." A long pause while the wind rose and screamed and fell again. "We are not the ones it's coming for." And far below, down in the black timber, down in the direction of the sleeping and defenseless valley, the wind carried up to her a single sound. It might have been a shutter, torn loose from its hinges. It might have been a chimney, at long last, giving up. Or it might have been only the first low morning note of a very long night. A night the patient mountain had been preparing, in its slow and ancient way, to teach an entire valley about, since long, long before any living soul among them had ever set foot upon its stone. She closed her eyes, and warm against the deep wall, with her hand on the breathing side of the one living thing she had left in all the world, she settled in to wait for the morning, while all around her, unfelt and unheeded, the great storm spent its rage against the one wall in all that country that it could not move. The storm did not lift the next day, nor the day after that. The wind that had come down out of the pass held its shape and its fury for 4 full days and 3 long nights, changing only in the quarter from which it drove the snow. And the drifts grew and grew against the north side of every cabin in the valley until they climbed past the sills of the windows and buried the lower panes in white. And through all of it, deep inside the mountain, the woman kept a kind of vigil. She kept it in the back leaves of an old book she had carried up from the ruins of the cabin. Her husband's book. The one thing of his she had never once been able to leave behind. She wrote in a small, careful hand, with a stub of pencil, by the light of the little stove. But she did not write down her fear. She wrote down her fuel. Half an armload burned at midday, half an armload the next midday, a full armload on the 3rd morning, because the cold outside had finally begun to press its way past the outer wall, and she wanted the deep stone brought back up to its working warmth before nightfall. A half armload on the 4th day. That was all, and what she did not need to write down, because her own hand kept telling it to her every morning without fail, was the temperature of the wall behind her bed. She measured it the only way she had. She laid her bare palm flat against the granite, and she held it there, and she counted slowly to 30, and the count did not lie. On the first morning of the storm, the stone had been merely cool, but by the 4th, after 4 days of small, careful, patient fires, the stone gave back into her palm a soft and steady warmth that did not fade in the whole length of the count. The mountain, in its slow and stubborn way, had begun to remember the shape of a lived-in room, and the mule remembered too. Amos had settled past his lameness, past the shagginess of his thickening winter coat. He had settled into the placid, contented rhythm of an animal who has understood, deep in his patient bones, that the roof over his head is not going anywhere. He ate the small ration of oats she brought him each morning. He drank the water she thawed for him at noon, and he turned his great head at odd hours toward the sound of her opening the stove door. Not because he cared a whit about the fire, but because he cared about her hands, which were, in his simple and certain world, the source of every good thing that had ever come to him. And on the 3rd long night of the storm, she spoke to him, in a voice she had not used since a green and gentle country a whole life ago. "You were his mule before you were mine," she said softly into the dark, and she rested her forehead against the warm curve of his neck, the way she had on that terrible morning of his lameness. "He chose you for your ears. Do you know that? He said you had honest ears." A small, tired sound that in another woman might have been a laugh. I didn't understand back then that a man could choose a mule for the shape of his ears. I thought he was teasing me. She was quiet a moment. "I understand it now. He was right. He was right about you all along." The mule did not answer, because he was a mule. But the warmth of his neck against her forehead answered for him. And in that dark and buried room, with the great storm screaming itself hoarse against a wall it could not break, it was answer enough. Something was healing in her through those 4 long days, not the wound itself. Grief does not close over like that, and she knew it. She was too honest a woman to believe it ever would, but something in the way she carried it. For 2 years she had held it the way she held everything, alone, in silence, turned away so that no one would see her shoulders move. She had made of her grief a private stone, and she had carried that stone the way she carried water, or wood, or the weight of a mule's ruined leg, with her hands and her back, and her refusal to set it down. And in the dark of the mountain, at last, she was learning a different thing. She was learning that a burden held in the open, spoken aloud to a listening ear, even the ear of a mule, grows no lighter exactly, but it grows possible to carry. She thought of Elias in those long hours, not with the sharp, tearing pain she had run from for 2 years, but with something quieter now, something almost like company. She remembered his low, sure voice on the ridge. "This is where we grow old." And she had hated that memory once, had turned from it the way she turned from the wind, because it had felt like a lie the mountain had told them both, a cruel promise broken before it was fairly begun. But now, warm against the stone he had led her to, though neither of them had ever known the cave was there, she turned the memory over in her mind, slowly, the way her father turned a stave in the lamplight, looking for the grain, and she found in it a thing she had not seen before. He had not been wrong about the growing old. He had only been wrong about the together. She was going to grow old on this ground. She could feel it now, in the warm, patient stone at her back. She was going to grow old here, exactly as he had said, and some part of him, she chose to believe, was in the choosing of it, in the mule with the honest ears, in the book with her fuel counted in its margins, in the very shape of the ground that had, at the last, agreed to keep her. "A home isn't wood or stone," he had told her once in the last quiet quarter hour before sleep. "A home is the place you're still breathing when you wake up." She was breathing. Come the deep of the winter, come the worst the mountain had, she was going to keep on breathing. And that, she understood now, was a kind of keeping faith with him, the only kind left to her. And it was enough. The wind broke at first light on the 4th day. She noticed it in her sleep, the way a person notices any long, steady sound the moment it stops. The absence of it, louder than the sound had ever been. She lay still a long minute beneath her blankets, listening for whatever had come to replace the wind. and there was nothing. There was only a stillness so deep and so complete that she could hear the tin of the flue ticking softly to itself as it cooled. She rose. She pulled on her coat. She ducked beneath the sanded blanket and crossed the cold outer chamber to the mouth of the cave. The snow had drifted against the throat of the stone wall to within a foot of the top, but she had thought of this long before. She had made herself a wooden scraper that fit her mittened hand, and she used it now, and 10 minutes of steady work opened a passage she could crouch and push her way through, and she stepped out onto the shelf of rock, and the world was white and still and enormous. The pines below the outcrop stood so laden with snow that some had bent all the way to the ground and stayed there, frozen mid-bow, like mourners who could not rise. The flat where her cabin had once stood was a single smooth and unbroken bowl of white, no wreckage showing, no line of a foundation, not one stone of all her failed and heartbreaking labor left visible to the eye. The mountain had drawn its white sheet up over the whole of it, and the valley below, where the settlement lay. The valley was hidden too, beneath the same soft and terrible blanket. She stood a long moment, searching it, and from where she stood, high on her shelf of stone, she could not see a single thread of smoke rising from it. Not one. She went back inside. She built the small morning fire. She heated water for her coffee. And she took up the pencil and wrote in the back of the book, in the same steady hand, "Wind broken at dawn. No fresh snow." And then one line more. 6 armloads used in 6 days. She looked at that last number a long, long time. 6 armloads, not 6 cords, not 6 great ricks of split cordwood, the way the men down in the valley were even now burning through their winters, feeding the cold everything they had, and finding it was never enough. 6 armloads of split pine, no thicker than her wrist. She looked at that number the way another woman might have looked at a letter from a brother long thought lost. Then she closed the book. She drank her coffee, and she began the day. Down in the buried valley, at that same gray hour, the digging had begun. They dug from their doors. They dug from their windows. They dug long tunnels through the drifts to woodsheds they had not laid eyes on in 4 days. And they counted their losses as they dug. The younger man, the shift boss, had lost the feeling in the smallest toes of one foot. On the second night, when his own stove had briefly gone dark, and he could not get it lit again without opening the shutter to the wind, he would walk with a hitch in his step, come spring, that he would carry the rest of his life. The clerk, the one with the coughing daughter, had frozen his hand past the knuckle, and would be short a finger by the deep of winter. And these were the ones the storm had merely marked. There was a man of the cloth in that settlement, a plain and weary preacher who tended his small flock without much hope of reward. And in the pale forenoon of that 4th day, when the wind had finally broken, he took up a shovel and walked the length of the buried main street, stopping at each cabin in turn, knocking, waiting, calling out, moving on. And it was he who came, at last, to the low cabin at the south edge, the cabin of the old man, Tobias Finch, and he found no smoke at the flue, and no smoke stain on the snow of the roof, where the warmth of a living fire should have melted it clear, and no answer to his knock. He put his shoulder to the drift and forced the frozen door. And he found inside no living thing, only the old man on his cot, turned toward the wall, and a single cold coal in the ash pan that was by now no warmer than the room around it. The preacher sat down slowly on the edge of that cot, his hat still on his head. And he said the old words over the still face of the old man. The words for the dead. He did not weep as he said them. He had lived too many winters in that hard country. He had used up long ago the tears a man keeps set aside for old men who counted their cordwood too low and hoped too hard for a gentle season. And when the words were finished, he drew the blanket up over the old man's face, the same blanket the old man had died beneath. And he closed the door of the cabin behind him, and he walked back through the drifts to the small church at the north end of the street. And he took hold of the frozen rope, and he rang the bell twice. In the old pattern, the one that told the whole valley without a single word needing to be spoken, that somebody had gone. And the sound of that bell carried, thin and clear across the snow, all the way up the mountain, and it reached the woman in the cave. She was outside when it came to her, splitting kindling on a downed log she had dragged into the shelter of the stone, and she stopped, the maul held still at the top of its arc, and she listened. Twice. A pause. Twice again. In confirmation. She lowered the maul slowly. She knew that pattern. Everyone in that country knew that pattern, and she stood a long moment in the cold, bright, terrible stillness, with the thin sound of the bell dying away over the white valley below. Somebody had gone. She did not yet know who. She would not know, for a while yet, whose name the bell had carried up to her. But she understood, standing there, the full and awful shape of the thing, that she was alive, that she was warm, that 6 armloads of thin split pine had carried her, whole and breathing, through the very same nights that had gone into that cabin down below like a hand, and closed. And there was no triumph in it. None at all. There was only the bell, and the white silence after the bell, and a grief that had nothing to do, this time, with her own losses, but that belonged somehow to the whole of that buried and suffering valley. She thought of the men who had laughed at her in the warm and smoky room down below. She thought of the one who had said she should have married a bat. She did not hate them for it now. She found she could not. They had only been afraid, the way frightened people are always a little cruel. And now some of them were dying of the very thing they had been so sure they understood, and she was not. And there was no justice in that she could see, and no victory. Only the cold arithmetic of who had happened to lay her hand against the right stone, in the right dark, on the right and terrible night. She looked down at the valley a while longer. Then she gathered her split kindling into her arms, and she carried it inside, out of the cold, because that was the thing left to do. And she had learned, over 2 hard years, that when there is nothing else to be done, you do the thing that is left. And far down the mountain, in the trampled snow at the edge of the timber, a lean and weathered man had already taken his rifle down from its pegs. He had folded a wool blanket into his pack. He had tied 2 strips of dried meat to the top of it. He had whistled his dog into her corner and told her to stay. And he had started up the long switchbacks toward the high flat above the falls. He did not tell his wife where he was going. He did not entirely know himself why he was going, only that a man who had stood in a warm barroom and told a laughing crowd that a certain widow was a fool who did not know better, owed that widow, at the very least, the plain courtesy of climbing up to see whether her fool's shelter had held. He did not expect to find her alive. He was carrying the blanket, if the truth be told, to wrap her body, and the dried meat for himself. On the long, cold walk back down, the trail fought him every step. The drifts came to his hips in the low places, and he broke through the frozen crust at every third stride and had to haul himself up out of it again and again and again. It took him from the first gray light nearly to noon to reach the high flat above the falls, and when he came at last out of the buried timber onto the open shelf below the outcrop, he stopped dead in his tracks, with the steam of his own hard breathing hanging in the still air before his face, because there was smoke, thin, pale, patient, rising straight up from the granite face of the mountain into the still and brilliant winter sky. And somewhere beneath that smoke, somewhere inside that wall of ancient stone, there was a person alive enough to be burning wood. He stood a full minute before he could make his own feet move again, and she was outside when he came round the last shoulder of the trail. She was splitting her kindling in the shelter of the outcrop, her wool coat unbuttoned at the throat, because the work had warmed her enough that she could afford, at last, to let it breathe. She looked up, and her face, when she saw him standing there, was not at first the face of a woman surprised to see anyone at all. It was the face of a woman surprised to see him. "Mr. Marsh," she said, and she lowered the maul. "You're a long way from your line." He could not at first find any words to answer her with. He was looking past her, at the wall of dry stacked stone that closed most of the mouth of the cave, at the clean, well-made chimney of tin rising from the fissure above, at the small, neat pile of split pine inside the wall. That could not have amounted to a third of a cord. And that was, by any measure, he had ever in his life taken less wood than he himself had burned in these same 6 days, in a far smaller cabin, and still had ice on the inside of his water bucket every single morning. He took off his hat. He did not know he was going to do it until it was done. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out drier than he had meant it to. "I came up here to bring you a blanket." She looked at him a moment, and she understood, perhaps, exactly what the blanket had been for. "You're welcome to come in out of the cold," she said, and she turned toward the narrow gap in the stone wall. "Bring it. I've got coffee on." And he followed her, because there was nothing else in that moment that he was capable of doing. He crouched and pushed his way through the narrow passage in the wall. He stepped past the mule, whose ears turned toward him without the slightest alarm. He pushed aside the heavy sanded blanket that hung across the inner door, and he stood, at last, in the middle of a framed room, in the middle of a mountain. And he drew one long breath, all the way down to the bottom of his lungs. And he understood. The air in that room was not the air outside. It was cool. It was still. It was not, in any way he had a word for, the air of a cave. It was the air of a room a person could live in, a room a person, plainly, had been living in. He crossed to the deep wall behind the platform bed, and he laid his bare hand flat against the granite, and he held it there. And he did not, for a slow count of 10, take it away. "You've been keeping a fire in here," he said at last, quietly, almost to himself. "No," she answered, and she poured the coffee and put the hot tin cup into his cold hands. "I've been keeping the mountain." She looked at him steadily. "The fire I keep only long enough to keep the mountain warm. The mountain does all the rest." He said nothing. He could not. "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," she said, not unkindly. "You look like a man who's walked a long way uphill through a great deal of snow." And he sat on the edge of the platform because there was no chair. And he drank the coffee she had given him. And slowly, slowly, the feeling began to come back into his hands. And after a while, when he had the breath for it, he asked her the question that had been building in him since the moment he first saw that impossibly small pile of split pine. "How much wood," he said, "how much wood have you burned since the storm came in?" "6 armloads," she said. She said it without any pride at all. 6 armloads of split pine, no thicker than my wrist. I haven't yet touched the larger rounds. He set the cup down, very carefully, on the platform beside him, and he did his own arithmetic in his own head, and it came out to something under 300 pounds of wood, less than half a cord, for 6 days, for 6 nights, through the very worst that the mountain had, while he himself, in his tight and well-built little cabin down the drainage, had burned near 2 full cords, and had still lain shivering on the 3rd night, watching the ice form on the inside of his own bucket. He looked at the wall he had just laid his hand against. He looked at the woman sitting across from him in the warm and quiet dark, and he did not, in that moment, find any words at all. What he found instead was a sentence that simply would not stay inside his mouth. "Ma'am," he said, and his throat worked around it. "A while back, I stood in a barroom down in the gulch, and I told a whole room full of men that you were a woman who didn't know any better." He stopped. "I've come up here today to tell you that I was wrong. And I've come to tell you a great deal more than that, only I don't have the words for the rest of it." And she looked at him, and for the first time in all his sight of her, there was, at the very corner of her mouth, the smallest of smiles. "You don't need the rest of it," she said gently. "You can take the blanket back down with you, Mr. Marsh. I find I don't need it." A pause. "Somebody down in that valley is going to need it a great deal more than I do." And he nodded, and he could not, for the life of him, speak. He rose to go, and at the inner door, with the sanded blanket in his hand, he stopped and looked back at her, and he asked one last thing, looking at the floor and not at her. Was there anybody, down in the storm, anybody lost? "Somebody," she said quietly. "I heard the bell this morning. I don't yet know whose name it carried." A silence. "You'll tell me," she said, "on your next trip up." And he nodded, and he pushed his way back out through the sanded blanket and through the passage in the stone, and out into the blinding white and the terrible cold. And he walked back down the long buried mountain, with the folded blanket still in his pack, and the dried meat still uneaten, and the warm, strange taste of a coffee he had not paid for still on his tongue. And behind him, unmoved and unbreakable, The mountain went on, keeping the shape of a room, just as it had been taught. He told it different this time. Down in the low-ceilinged room, in the last blue hour of that same day, the trapper came in out of the cold with the folded blanket still riding in his pack. And the men looked up at him, the way men always look up, half ready for a story to laugh at. And he gave them one. But he gave it to them slow. And he gave it to them without a single laugh anywhere in it. And this time, not one man in that room laughed with him. He told them of the smoke, rising thin and straight and patient, up out of the solid granite, into a sky the color of cold iron. He told them of the pile of split pine, no bigger than a half-grown boy could carry in his 2 arms. He told them the number, and he let it sit there in the warm and smoky air where all of them could look at it. 6 armloads, 6 days, through the very worst the mountain had. And when he said it, the old carpenter, Nathaniel Crane, who had been sitting near the stove with his cup cradled in his 2 hands, reached out and set that cup down, flat, on the plank. And then he reached up and he took off his hat, and he did not put it back on. "Less than half a cord," he said. He said it very quietly. So quietly that the men nearest him had to lean in over the plank to catch it at all. And then he said one word more. And that word was not for the room. It was for himself. Wrong. He turned it over slowly on his tongue, the way a man turns over a taste he has never once tasted in all his life. "I have been wrong," he said, "all of these years." For in his mind, an old carpenter had already walked into that impossible room. He had already laid his own broad hand against that warm and patient stone, and he had felt 3 whole generations of hard certainty come loose inside his chest, like a hoop that had been badly seated from the very start, and had only now, at last, been struck true. And a few days on, when the drifts along the switchbacks had settled enough that a careful man might walk them without going into his waist, he went up the mountain to see the thing for himself. He did not go up alone. The trapper went with him, and so did a 3rd man, a driller by trade, who had known her husband years before, in another camp, in another and a kinder season, and who had never once, through the whole of that long and bitter winter, spoken a single word against her in any barroom in the valley. The 3 of them spent the better part of an hour outside the stone wall, before ever they set foot within it. Crane walked the whole length of the dry stacked stone with the flat of his hand laid along the top course, feeling the fit and the run of it. He tested each long tie stone with a knuckle. He tapped the base of the wall in 3 places with the small hammer he had carried up in his coat pocket, the way a man taps a wheel, or the head of a barrel, listening close for the honest truth of the thing. The driller crouched and studied the narrow throat of the passage, and the clever, deliberate angle where the wall turned itself back to meet the living rock of the mountain. And the trapper simply stood a little apart, and watched the 2 of them work, and said nothing. And then, at last, they went inside. She had let the little fire die hours before they ever arrived, on purpose, so that not one of them could go home and say she had fooled them with a fresh-built blaze and a warm stove. The iron was stone cold to the touch. The room was cool at the shoulders. Crane had brought a thermometer up the mountain with him, a fine one, of German mercury, that he had ordered by post a very long time ago, and had never once, in all the years since, had a good enough reason to unpack. He set it down on the platform bed, and then he did not look at it, not for a quarter of an hour, because he was a man who understood, deep in the marrow of his trade, that a thing measured too soon will always tell a lie. While the mercury sat and settled, the driller crossed the little room to the deep wall at the back and laid his hand against it and held it there. And after a long moment, without turning around, he said very quietly, "Come over here. Come put your hand on this." And Crane came, and he put his hand on the deep stone, and he held it there a long, long time. And then, without a word, he crossed back across the room and laid that same hand flat against the cold outer face of the wall down near the mouth, where the winter pressed in against the far side of it. And then he came back and laid his hand once more against the warm, deep stone behind the bed. He was running an experiment, and she knew exactly what he was doing, and she let him do it, in peace, without a word. He was proving a thing to himself. One bare palm at a time. He was proving that the heart of the mountain was warmer than its cold edge, by a difference his own hand could feel and measure, without any instrument in all the world to help him do it. And when at last he was satisfied, he turned and he sat down, heavily, on the edge of the platform bed, and he looked at the mercury. 51, he said. He glanced up at the other two. 51 degrees. In here, with that fire dead since this morning. He sent the youngest of them, the trapper, back out into the cold, to read the small thermometer they had hung on the outer wall when they first came up. The man came back in a minute later, stamping the snow from his boots, his breath still white around his face. 19, he said. 19 above, and it's still dropping. And the old carpenter sat there a while, on the edge of that bed, with his big and capable hands hanging loose and empty between his knees. He looked at the mercury a while, and then he looked, for a good deal longer, at her. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not the sure and easy voice of the man who had held court by the stove down in the valley, and told a laughing room that a widow was sleeping against a block of ice. It was the voice of a man who had come, late and hard in his long life, to the very end of a certain kind of certainty. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been building in this country for a great many years. I have taught younger men my trade. I have written down in my own hand on good paper the right way to raise a wall, and the right way to lay a hearth that draws clean." He passed his hand, once, slowly, down the length of his gray beard. "And I have believed, the whole of those years, that a man who worked in stone was working in the cold, and that only a man who worked in wood was working in the warmth." He paused, and the paper-thin ticking of the cooling flue was the only sound in the room. "I stand corrected." He looked at her, steady, and there was no shame in his face when he said it. There was only a clean and a plain and a hard-won humility. "You have taught me a thing I was certain I already knew, which is the very hardest kind of thing there is for an old man to learn. And I do not say this easily, and I have never once in all my life said the like of it to any man down in that gulch." He drew a breath. "But I say it here, to you, because you have earned the saying of it." And she did not smile. She had learned over that long and watchful winter that a woman who smiled at a man's apology would only be called proud for the smiling of it, so she only nodded, once, in a way that took his words and honored them and gave them back, without keeping any of them for herself. The name the bell had carried came up the mountain in the days that followed. The trapper brought it, as he had promised her he would. The old man from the low cabin at the south edge of the settlement, Tobias Finch, gone in the deep of the storm, alone in a cold room, with a cord and a half of good wood that a doubled price had quietly turned from enough into not enough. She took the news standing in the mouth of her stone wall, and she was quiet a long while after she had it. She had not known the old man well. She had hardly known him at all, but she knew the exact shape of what had happened to him. She knew it the way she knew the grain of a length of oak. He had counted his wood, honest. He had lived his life careful, and in the end, it had not been the cold that killed him. It had been a number written into a ledger, by a warm hand, in a warm room, by a man who had never once had to wonder in all his life whether his own fire would last the night. And she did not forget it. She folded it away inside her, next to her other griefs, and she did not forget it. He came up the mountain himself, at the very last, on a good horse that plainly hated the deep drifts, with two men walking on foot behind him whose names she did not know. She saw him coming from the mouth of the stone wall, long before he ever saw her. And so she had all the time she needed to arrange her face. She arranged it into nothing at all. He did not get down from the horse, and he did not take off his hat, though the two men on foot behind him took off theirs. "Mrs. Vance," said Cyrus Thorne, "I have come with a proposal, one that I believe you will find a great deal more agreeable than the last one I brought you." She let the silence sit between them. She knew, by now to the penny, exactly how much that silence cost a man like him. "The company," he said at last, "is prepared to pay you a considerable sum of money for the exclusive teaching of your method." He did not say the word cave. He had not once said the word cave in all her hearing since the morning she had faced him down across a store counter and made a fool of him in front of the whole town. "Your method," he said. "You will come down to the valley as our guest. A warm room. Board. A fair honorarium. You will show my carpenters what you have done up here and how you have done it. And that is all. Your ground remains your own ground. The offer to buy it is withdrawn. I withdraw it here, now, in front of these two witnesses." And she let him hold that silence a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she stepped out, fully, into the bright and bitter light, so that he could see her plainly, so that all three of them could. And she gave him the answer she had turned over and over in her mind, sentence by careful sentence, through 3 long evenings beside the little stove. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "this method is not mine to sell to your company." She stood very still as she said it. "It belongs to the mountain, and any man who cares to walk up here in the daylight and look with his own eyes at what I have built and ask me an honest question will get an honest answer from me. He will pay me nothing at all, and he will pay you nothing at all." She held his pale and patient eyes with her own, and she did not look away. And if any such man should feel, afterward, that he owes a debt to somebody for the knowing of it, then he can carry that debt down the mountain, and pay it to the family of the old man who was buried this week, because his woodshed came up short, and your company's wood had gone dear. A pause. There are 3 or 4 such families down in that valley now, Mr. Thorne. Widows and children. I will write you out a list of their names, if it would help you find them. And the 2 men on foot behind him did not, in that moment, look at their employer. They looked very hard at the snow beneath their boots. And Thorne's face, beneath the brim of the hat he had not troubled himself to remove, did not move. But something in the quality of his stillness changed. She had seen it change twice before now, in the store, that first morning, when she had refused his money to his face, and again in the store, in the deep of autumn, when she had answered him about the granite vault of his own bank. It was not anger. Thorne did not do anger, not in front of witnesses. It was a lifetime of certainties meeting for the very first time, a figure they could not absorb. You are refusing, he said slowly. A considerable sum of money. I am refusing to be your instrument, she answered him. There is a great difference between the two. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice to him. She had learned, long ago, that a quiet answer held a man like Thorne far more surely than a loud one ever could. Any man in your employ who wishes to live through the next winter is welcome up here. Bring them yourself, if it suits you. I will be glad to show you the flue. He did not answer her. Not at once. He looked past her, instead, at the wall of dry stacked stone, at the fine straight thread of smoke rising up into the cold and brilliant blue, at the whole impossible thing she had made, out of nothing but stone, and grief, and stubbornness, and one single honest lesson about the deep patience of granite. And then he looked back at her, and he touched the brim of his hat. 1 degree, no more than that. Good day, Mrs. Vance, he said, and he turned the horse, and he rode back down the long switchbacks with the 2 men walking on foot behind him. And he did not speak a single word to either one of them, the whole long way down. That night, so the story in the valley went, he sat alone at his desk until nearly midnight, with a letter to a city lawyer laid out in front of him, and a pen in his hand. He did not finish the letter. He folded it away, unfinished, into a drawer, and come the spring, and the summer, and all the long years after, he never once took it out again. For a strange and a quiet thing had happened in that valley over the course of a single hard winter. A whole town had stood and watched a widow they had laughed at do the one thing that not one of them could do. They had watched her keep herself warm on a wall they had all sworn was a wall of ice, and that very same town had buried an old man in the frozen ground. An old man whose lonely death had a price written down right next to it, in a ledger, in a warm and careful and unhurried hand. And a town that has seen those 2 things, side by side, in the space of 1 winter, is no longer the same town it was in the gold and easy days of the autumn. Something in it had shifted, quietly. The way the deep frost shifts underground, where no eye can see it, and heaves a whole road up out of true by spring. The men began to come up the mountain when the snow softened, not many of them at first. The old carpenter, Crane, who wanted to learn a thing he had spent his whole life teaching wrong, and had found, late, the humility to become a student of it, the driller, the younger man with the new hitch in his step from the toes he had frozen in the storm, who went and found a stretch of granite on a ridge of his own, and read the run of its cracks the way she had shown him, and slept warm that next winter for the first time in the whole of his hard life. And she taught every one of them, just exactly as she had told Thorn she would. She charged them not 1 cent. She asked of them only one thing, each and every man. She made each of them promise her the same thing before he went back down the mountain, that when the day came, and it would come, that another cold and frightened and desperate soul stood down at the foot of that mountain, not knowing how in the world they were going to live through the coming winter, that man would climb up and he would teach the thing forward, and he would charge that soul nothing at all, and he would ask of them only this same single promise in return. And so the knowing of it spread, not through any company, not through any ledger, or any deed, or any patient man's private iron safe. It spread the way warmth itself spreads, through good and honest stone, slowly, quietly, from the one hand to the next hand, from the one hard winter to the next hard winter, carried down the years by ordinary people who had felt in their own aching bones the simple and enormous difference between a room that fights the cold with everything it has and loses, and a room that makes its quiet peace with the mountain and lets the mountain do the work. The rich vein of silver that lay beneath her ground was never worked, not by him, not by anyone. The patient man never got his hands on it. All of his cold arithmetic, in the end, came to exactly nothing. Because he had built the whole of it, every figure and every year of his patience, upon one single certainty that he had never once thought to question: that a woman, alone, in a cold and merciless country, would surely and conveniently die. And she had simply declined to do it. She lived on that high ground a great many years. She never did marry again, though she was asked, and kindly more than once, by decent men who had come to respect her. She would thank each of them plainly, and she would not explain her no, and she did not need to, for she had found, in the dark heart of a mountain, the very thing she had lost in the dark heart of a mining shaft. Not a husband. She knew better than to look for that twice, but a way of being at home, and unafraid, inside her own one life, a way of waking, morning after morning after morning, and finding herself still there, still breathing, still warm, which was, her husband had told her once, in the last quiet quarter hour before a long ago sleep, the only thing a home was ever truly for. And here, at the very last, is the quiet and the curious truth of it. She never became famous. There was no grand monument raised to her. Most of the shelters that came after hers were never written down in any book at all, and her name came to be known only to the small handful who had learned the thing from her hands, and to the handful more who had learned it, in turn, from theirs. And she would have wanted it, she once said, exactly and only that way. For she had come to understand a thing, over that one long winter in the stone, that a great many people go their whole lives and never quite manage to learn, that the deepest and the truest kind of winning makes almost no sound at all. It does not look like a fortune won. It does not look like a name carved deep into cold stone, for strangers to stop and read 100 years on. Sometimes it looks like nothing more in all the world than an old woman and an old gray mule with honest ears, walking down a green mountain trail together in the soft of the spring, with their feet in the good black mud, and the first tender grass of the whole long year coming up green all around the both of them. She had promised him that once, on the coldest morning of the coldest winter of her life, with her forehead pressed against his warm neck in the dark and the cold pressing in at the wall, that he would walk out of it, at her shoulder, come the spring. And he did. And so, in the end, did she. And that was the whole of it. That was the whole of what she had won. Not that she had beaten the cold. Anyone at all, given the right stone and the right teaching, can learn in time to beat the cold. But that she had refused the whole way through it, from the first night to the last, to let herself grow as cold as the very thing that was trying so hard to kill her, that she had counted her thin fuel and buried her heavy grief and faced down a patient and a merciless man across the snow, and had come out the far side of all of it, somehow, still warm, still gentle, still willing to lift the blanket at her door and pour a stranger a hot cup of coffee and sit him down and teach him how to live. The mountain kept the shape of that warm room a long, long time after she was gone from it. And some things, once they have been warmed all the way through, slow and patient, down to the very heart of them, are very slow indeed, ever to go cold again